In this presentation, I'm going to be continuing from where I left off on the previous one, which was part one of the introduction to the study of terminology. So what I'm going to cover is these four sections. First of all, I'm going to be talking about the difference between terminology and lexicography. Secondly, I will be talking briefly about the nature of specialized language, which goes beyond the concept of terminology. Thirdly, we'll be looking at what the activity of terminology management, which I referred to last week, actually refers to. And then finally, I'll be enumerating a number of do's and don'ts. Some of these have already come up during the classwork last week, but I will be going over those again. So the difference between terminology and lexicography. So briefly, terminology, as you know, is the study or the collection or the management of specialized vocabulary relating to a particular subject area. And it involves compiling term bases or terminology databases which reflect the usage of the specialized vocabulary. On the other hand, lexicography refers to the writing of dictionaries. And there is a distinction between the two, and I'm going to try and illustrate this distinction by showing you examples of, first of all, of dictionaries, and secondly, of term bases. So let's have a look at some screenshots of a few dictionaries. First of all, this comes from a very standard English dictionary, and you'll see that the head word here is serve, which is, in most cases, it's a verb. And this distinguishes two different meanings of the word serve. First of all, perform duties or services for another person or an organization, and secondly, to present food or drink to someone. And this dictionary entry provides examples and gives some subcategories of meaning. But importantly, in line with the standard dictionary approach, it lists different meanings of the same word under the same entry. Let's look at our second example now. This comes from the same dictionary, and once again we have a range of different meanings listed, but here this entry goes one stage further because it lists usages of this item, which are nouns, and other ones which are verbs, and they're listed side by side within a single entry. It also gives an image. That's something you tend to encounter to some extent in term bases, but importantly, it's taking the word, it's taking a word as its starting point, and it's investigating all the different meanings, and that is what you tend to find in dictionary writing or lexicography. One third example, now this is it's a bilingual dictionary, so we have the Chinese word, which in Putonghua is pronounced dianzi, meaning electron, but straight away it launches out into a list of different terms, all under this same head word. And once again, this is quite standard in bilingual dictionary usage, but you don't tend or shouldn't really see it in terminology entries. Now let's have a look at a term base. So this is a monolingual term base, and as you see, it comes from the general area of healthcare or alternative medicine. And each term here is very specific, and some terms consist of a number of words, or more than one word, I should say. And each term is given basically one meaning and one definition. All right? here we've got, this is the interface of SDL Trados Multiterm, which is their terminology application. So on the left-hand side, you see that the term ASP is activated, and we have the English entry, and alongside it we have the German entry. And the English entry has a definition, as does the German. And it also has, it's noted that it's an acronym and so on. And under where it says active server pages, it notes that that is in fact the full form, and a source is given. And if we clicked on any of the other entries on the left-hand side, we would see a similar collection of information. This is another terminology application which works in a very similar manner. So a photo printer is highlighted, and this time it provides an image, just in case you don't know what a photo printer looks like. And we have, for the English, we have two different terms, or essentially they're the same term, but with slightly different spelling convention. And for the purposes of the context, or maybe the company for which this term base was constructed, the form that should be used is photo printer without the hyphen. And that will be the convention that is used within that particular company. And it goes so far as to say that photo printer with the hyphen has to be avoided, it's forbidden. This, as you can see, it's only an extract from a longer entry. So it gives the German, then it gives the Chinese, it might also give other languages as well, with indications as to usage where necessary. This is an online database. This is the UN, you'll probably recognize it, and this is a search for the term food security. And what it's done is it's given the Chinese equivalent as it's found it in every single entry that contains that combination of words. And this is the term application used in the European Union, and as you can see, it's very multilingual, and you can choose a source language, and you can choose any number of target languages, and you put in a search term, and once again it comes up with information from every entry that it finds. Okay then, so we've looked at some examples of each, term bases and dictionaries. Let's try to sum up some of the differences that exist between the two. So a term base will deal in a concept rather than a word, deal in concepts rather than words, I should say. So that with the dictionaries we saw one entry covering every possible meaning of a word, whereas with the term bases, the concept as it's reflected in one particular term was foremost. So one term, one entry, one term, one concept, broadly speaking. So yeah, one entry per one concept per entry. This means that separate meanings of a word, which would be arguably different terms, will be dealt with in separate entries. Because of the way information within a term base is accessed, there's no need to list the terms alphabetically at all, although that can be convenient for the human user, depending on how the database is going to be searched. General language is not included, and certain parts of speech are also generally excluded. Prepositions, pronouns, conjunctions, for example. These generalizations will generally hold true, but not inevitably. So you might find term bases that don't entirely conform to all these principles. And the same holds true for the rest of this list. So term bases tend to be prescriptive. In other words, they are indicating correct usage and also what forms may need to be avoided. Whereas dictionaries very often these days are more descriptive, so they are intended to reflect the way users will employ a particular word. Term bases are as well, of course, generally aimed at a more specialist audience. Moving on, let's have a look at how synonyms, homonyms, and polysemes tend to be treated in dictionaries and in term bases. So synonyms, you're of course aware of, familiar with synonymy. Homonyms were when two different words either look the same or sound the same. For the purposes of term bases, it would be a question of looking the same, being spelt the same way. Whereas polysemes would be separate meanings of a single word. So what we saw in the dictionaries we looked at was that synonyms are presented separately. Falling wherever they do in alphabetical listing across a dictionary. Okay, so synonyms, two words meaning the same thing, but not belonging to the same entry. Polysemes will be listed within a single entry because these are different meanings of the same word. So with the example of serve, meaning to work for somebody or to present somebody with food, those are gathered together under the single entry. Homonyms, which are two different words, two or more different words, looking the same, will be presented as two separate head words. Now in glossaries and term bases, synonyms belonging to a particular subject field will be grouped together. So you have a network of terms perhaps within a single entry. That's how it's often done anyway. Polysemes and homonyms will be presented separately, that is to say, in different entries, because they represent separate concepts. Okay, now I'm going to spend a couple of slides talking generally and fairly briefly about specialized language, because as I mentioned at the beginning, there is more to a specialized language than the terminology. Now, first of all, there is the usage of particular terms and words, and this can often be reflected in the collocational patterns that they enter into, so that if you're talking about an objection, you don't make an objection or create an objection, or I suppose you could, but the general collocation, the general noun, the general verb that should be used with that noun is to raise an objection. And you wouldn't say to make amnesia or to do amnesia, but to have amnesia, or I suppose to suffer from amnesia. Similarly, there are plenty of items in a technical text which one would not generally wish to categorize as terminology, but they are needed in order perhaps to support terminological items, or just because they are the words which are generally used in a particular context. Now, looking at the items I've underlined, you could argue that some of them are more terminological than others, perhaps, so that you might want to argue that executable would be a term. But on the other hand, towards the bottom where it says the program ends, I don't think anyone would say that that was a term. But it is the word which happens to be used within this specific specialized language. Okay? Now, of course, another feature of, or certainly of English specialized language, is the use of abbreviations and acronyms, which sometimes make a text quite difficult to follow if you're not familiar with them. Next, there is a use of nominalizations. Now, nominalization, of course, is the practice of using a noun to refer to something that is in fact a process. So the reason for my smiley face here is that the word nominalization is itself a nominalization. I could here have said a tendency to nominalize. But what often happens in specialized language is that you get the nominalization, so here we say tendency to use nominalizations. Sentences in specialized text are often very long, but contain what is essentially a simple structure, which may consist of connecting perhaps quite long noun phrases with simple verbs. And if you read through the example here, you'll see that that is in fact precisely what happens. Finally, you find a tendency towards impersonal constructions, where the subject of the verb, of the process, is not stated explicitly. So we're going to move on now to talk about terminology management, which is, of course, the principles and processes involved in collecting, organizing, storing, and retrieving terminological information, and for ensuring that terminology is used in a clear and consistent manner, for example, within a particular text or set of documentation or across an entire organization. Good terminology management will help reduce the amount of time spent on translating and revising, and this is particularly important when a set of documentation is being translated by more than one person, where it's vital to make every effort to ensure that terminology is used consistently. I mentioned this last week, I think. It's been calculated that experienced translators will spend between 20 and 25% of their time on terminology research, whereas less experienced translators may spend as much as 40 to 60% on the same activity. So it's an activity particularly indulged in by beginners or people fairly early on in their translation career, but it never goes away entirely. There are always terminological problems that translators need to solve. Now a few words about computer-based terminology management software. We'll be looking at least one system later on in the term. That's the one I mentioned earlier, which is SDL Trados Multiterm. So these will have a multilingual capability, and they will allow you to store different types of information within a single entry, as we saw in some of the examples earlier on in this presentation. They allow the user to define his or her own fields, and they will interface with an external program. In the past, that might have been a processor, a word processor, but now it's much more likely to be a translation memory tool. They will permit that external program to perform what's referred to as active term recognition, so that when you as a translator move on to a new sentence, it will scan that sentence and highlight all the terms which it is located within the term base, or sometimes it will open a window on the side of the screen and it will list them. And then what it will also often allow you to do is to paste in the particular term that you wish to use by means of a simple keyboard combination. And it will allow you to export the terms that you are holding within it, or import new terms from elsewhere. This is a typical term entry structure. So it allows not only for the term itself, but it makes it possible for you to have as many fields as you want relating to each other in various subtle ways. So not only the terms, but you can include information such as definitions, sources, notes, grammatical information, and so on. And I'm going to close now with a couple of screens of do's and don'ts. So first of all, the do's. This is really referring to the previous screen, because you will find yourself setting up a term-based structure later on in the term. You should make sure that you should try to ensure that you have the structure as you wish it to be right at the beginning. Some programs allow you to go back and change it later on, but not all do, so it's useful to give that some thought, i.e. whether you want to include a definition field, whether you want to have a source, and all kinds of things like that. Generally, you should aim to use the simplest form of every word, every noun or verb, which is included. And I know I focused on this last week. Use lowercase, that's for alphabet-based languages, unless use of the uppercase happens to be obligatory for a particular word. Give one meaning per entry. This is in the Excel spreadsheet scenario. And it might also be useful to provide some context for your terms. Finally, and we were talking about whether or not to trust information that you find on the internet and how to validate it, you should indicate your level of certainty, your confidence in the correctness or the reliability of a particular term. And now 2 or 3 don'ts. So if your glossary is specific to a particular project, then resist the temptation of including multiple translations, some of which are not going to be relevant to that project. This has come up before, but avoid highly polysemous items such as prepositions, which don't generally form part of the specialized vocabulary in any case. And try to avoid inconsistencies across multiple items. Now, these 3 items here, front loader, wheel loader, or backhoe loader, they are, in fact, they're all vehicles, but in fact they're 3 different ways of referring to the same vehicle. And as I said previously, you may find that one of them is the required term, the term required by a particular organization for their translation. So there we are. That's just a quick rundown of various further topics to do with terminology that I think it's useful for you to know at this stage. Thank you.